Okay, so today we're going to talk about cognitive stages during adolescence. So that's pretty much around the age of 13 to around 19. It's a really interesting time. It's probably one of my favorite times or age stages that we talk about because it's a really passionate and ever-changing, imaginative, exciting time. Okay, so what's happening to kids cognitively at this point? Well, adolescents tend to really focus in on their own feelings and the way that they think about things, okay? Whereas beforehand, they were spending a lot of time like listening to their parents or listening to their teachers and being guided by them. Now they're really interested in what they're thinking, and they're really interested in like what their peers are thinking about things. And unfortunately, they're also super interested in how people are thinking about them, right? Because um, it's not just about what they're thinking and what you're thinking, but how people are perceiving them, because their peers have probably become the most important thing in the world to them. Okay. Um, Another really cool thing about adolescence is that they're kind of like they're visionaries. They see the world and they see the potential and they see the ideal in a lot of things, and they believe that they can get that they can manifest the ideal with respect to a lot of ideas, the way they live their lives. I mean, they probably, at least I remember looking back at my parents and being like, oh, why did they just stop? Why did they just, go with what happened to them? Why didn't they try to do more with themselves? I'm going to do more with myself. I'm not going to be like them. I'm not going to be ordinary. I'm complacent. And, I'm sure all of you can remember feeling that way when you looked around at like adults, right? You're like, why did they settle? So, adolescents see, what they can become more than anything else. So it's a super exciting time. And honestly, that notion of ideals, I think, is really important in our culture. I mean, if you look at adults, when we start to get older, we start thinking about survival and family and how are we going to feed our kids. And, we become kind of um, thoughtful about actions to the point where we don't take a lot of chances. And when you're an adolescent, you take a lot of chances because you believe that you can do better, right? And so to a certain extent, that pushes our culture forward. So like politically, you can see, if you turn on the TV, you see kids at colleges and they're marching, and they want things to be more fair, more just. And with what happened with Wall Street, when everybody went down to Wall Street and was protesting down there, and tonight there was global warming. There was that meeting on global warming, and there were all the protesters outside. And if you looked at the population, a lot of them were super young. And one could argue that it's this need for the ideal, it's this passion to see the ideal in everything that kind of pushes our whole culture forward. So the thinking that goes on in adolescence, I think, is really important and really exciting. Okay, so what's going on? So one thing, though, that's a little uncomfortable for adolescents is egocentrism, adolescent egocentrism. Um, they believe that, the way they see things, the way they feel things, the way they think about things is unique. That they're not like everybody else, they're not ordinary, that there's something really special that kind of sets them above everybody else to a certain degree. Not that they really look down on others, but it's more like they just feel like there's this really amazing piece of themselves that they need to express, that they need to get out to the rest of the world. Um, Usually it starts at around 10. It says in your textbook it goes from 10 to 14. I would argue that it goes further because I know some 16-year-olds, and I would say they still have this in their thinking. So I don't think it goes away that quickly. I think that uniqueness, that belief in the self like this, actually stays later than the book says. Another component of adolescence cognition is something called the invincibility of personal fable. And basically, it's the idea that nothing can harm them. So let's think about it. You're like 13 years old. You see a bunch of your friends. You go over and you talk to them, and they're all smoking cigarettes. They offer you a cigarette, and you take it, even though you don't smoke. Why? Because for you, the most important thing is peer relations. Are you conforming to the peer group that you kind of really idolize or look up to or whatever it is or relate to? You want to be like them. You want to fit in. So you grab a butt and you smoke, and you don't think about, well, I could get addicted to this, and then that can lead to illnesses, right? That's not what goes on in adolescents' mind. They believe that they can do anything, really, and they're probably not going to get hurt. An example of this is like kids that get behind the wheel and drive really recklessly because they don't think that they're going to be the ones that get into the car accident. And it's kind of an argument about teenagers going into the army, so volunteering to go into the army, right? Because when they volunteer to go into service, they're thinking more about being one of these really, tough and powerful people that carry around guns and that are gonna help save the country and and that's really cool and that's very idealistic, like what we talked about earlier. But they may not necessarily understand 100% what kind of a risk that they're taking. They may not be walking into that situation fully grasping just how easily they can be killed, right? Because because of egocentrism, the invincibility, these kinds of things mask the consequences. And at this point, it's important to mention that in adolescence, the frontal cortex isn't fully developed. So the frontal cortex is like executive function. It's higher thinking, right? So it's reasoning, it's planning, it's impulse control, it's emotional regulation, it's understanding consequences of one's action. All those processes take place in the prefrontal cortex. And this isn't fully developed yet. So you can see that that those kinds of judgments, they're not online 100% yet. Okay. Lastly is something called the imaginary audience. I definitely remember this. I'm sure you guys do too. Teenagers or adolescents are very, very self-conscious. So if you've ever walked in the mall here, gone to East Mall or West Mall, and you just kind of walk around and watch teenagers, they tend to be kind of dramatic in the way they talk to each other and in their body language. And you can really see them looking around when they're and trying to suss out people who are watching them. They feel like when they walk in a room, I remember this when I would walk like into class or something, that everybody would turn around and look at you and would judge you. They have really strong reactions to the way that people react to them too. So for instance, you could have like a young girl who, let's say she's going to a restaurant and she's going with her parents and she walks into the restaurant and let's say there's a really cute waiter or something. And he looks at her, but not really, right? He looks at her for a second and turns away like he's not interested at all. So according to the imaginary audience, then this girl would be like, oh, wow, he didn't even notice me. He doesn't think I'm attractive. That's such a diss, right? On the other hand, if she walked into the restaurant and the waiter actually looked at her for a couple of minutes, or not even a couple of minutes, but like for 10 seconds longer, than normal. Then she might think, wow, he's really attracted to me. I must be really pretty. And she would start to feel really good about herself. So and meanwhile, it's very possible that the waiter wasn't even thinking about her when he looked at her. She was just in his line of vision, And yet, the adolescent will kind of interpret these kinds of things that occur in their environment as very personal, as reflecting their value, right? Um, they're very self-conscious if something isn't right about the way they look, like a zit or an overbite. Every detail of their body is important to them because they feel like everybody's looking at them, everybody's judging them. And that's probably why fashion is so important to them and the way they present themselves. Like here I've got piercings, right? So um, they feel like if they do something like that, like a piercing through their lip or something, that everybody's going to see it and everybody's going to have a feeling about it and everybody's going to judge it. So there are a lot of researchers that say that the imaginary audience is just that. It's an imaginary thing, and it's just this adolescence egocentrism that creates it. But I would argue this, that it's very possible that the imaginary audience is not real when we're thinking about like how adults view teenagers, because most of the time adults are thinking about a lot of things, and if there's a teenager that walks into their line of vision, they're not really going to notice that teenager unless it's like their own kid or something. So in that case, yeah, maybe the imaginary audience isn't actually real. But if we think about the imaginary audience with other adolescents, so how teenagers deal with each other, I think it's not imaginary. I think that other teenagers are constantly sussing one another out and judging one another. So in as far as the context of the imaginary audience with respect to their peers, I don't think it's imaginary at all. Okay? So I disagree with some researchers that have written papers saying that the imaginary audience is just that, completely imaginary. There are several researchers that have written papers that say, in actuality, it's kind of real. It's real with respect to peers and stuff like that. It just may be a little distorted when it comes to the adult world. Okay, so I did mention this, that during this time, the front portion of the brain is still developing. I have this movie called Inside the Teenage Brain. It's a Frontline movie, and I'm going to be posting that on the Blackboard for you guys to watch. I'm going to want you to write some sort of reflection on it, and you can read about the assignment and do the assignment. It's a really, really cool video. It's a little dated. It was made a while ago, but the thing that's really cool about it is that it pretty much parallels everything that they talk about in your textbook really well. And frequently I'll show a movie and it'll be kind of related to the topic but tangential, but this one isn't. It's pretty much spot on with our textbook, so you should definitely watch it. It's pretty cool. Okay, what else is going on? Here you see a picture of the brain. And there's the frontal cortex in the front, and you'll notice an area called the amygdala, okay, that little purple blob. Well, the amygdala is really, really important. It's where emotions get processed. And here's the important part of development, or what's occurring in adolescence as far as anatomy is concerned. What you've got is connections that go from the amygdala to the frontal cortex, and these connections basically are about emotions. So emotions get, sent directly to the amygdala. The amygdala deals with fear, anger, pleasure, and that information gets sent to the frontal cortex. Now, in adults, the frontal cortex, being that seat of executive function, then has a network that travels back to the amygdala and kind of regulates the emotions that are emanating from the amygdala. It inhibits a lot of the pathways. It might calm things down so that you can think rationally about whatever emotion it is. Well, in adolescence, that connection that goes from the frontal cortex back to the amygdala is not fully developed. So adolescents experience the emotion, they get all the action in the amygdala, all that information gets sent to the frontal cortex, but the frontal cortex doesn't have the right circuitry to go back and regulate the amygdala. And that's a really, really important component of development in adolescence. That's what kind of um, stops them from being impulsive, compulsive, or they tend to get super emotional about things. Maybe they base a lot of their choices on the emotional content of the situation rather than being analytic and rational about the situation. Okay, so I'm going to skip past this because we kind of talked about it. So what's going on as far as Piaget is concerned? So Piaget says that adolescents at this stage go through something called formal operations. Okay, they can really think on much more abstract level. So a great example would be like math, how they would deal with math. If you look at middle childhood, kids in middle childhood can do mathematical operations that are like 356 times 242. Okay, that it's complex, but adolescents can do like algebra, which is like 3xy times 4t equals 7 or whatever. So there you've got like abstract symbols that represent numbers, and they can do that kind of abstract thinking. They can manipulate those kinds of formulas. This is something that middle childhood can't do. Also, in adolescence, they're thinking about more intense abstract truths, right? So they're thinking about major issues, as you can see from these pictures, like abortion or the death penalty or global warming. All these big issues, they're now able to tackle it. They use something called deductive reasoning, where they're able to see like this really big idea and break it down into how it affects the world around. Okay, little kids can't do that. So a good example that they use in your book is if you're going to teach somebody like a kid in middle childhood about a culture, you would like choose your culture. Let's say it's France, and you would teach them this is what the French eat, this is where they live, these are the kinds of jobs they have, this is the political system they have, and leave it at that. But if you were going to teach an adolescent about a culture, you would take that culture and you would say France's economy is related to this country and this country, and this is the effect it has on global economy. And they're able to take something like an idea like that and apply it in a big world fashion. And kids during middle childhood can't do it. There's a really great example of this in your book when they talk about prejudice and how little kids are very straightforward in understanding about prejudice, whereas adolescents can think about it on a much larger scale. Like if you're going to change prejudice and you're in middle childhood, you're going to say, well, you should tell, people if they say something bad that that's wrong. Whereas an adolescence understands that it's not just about the individual, it's about the structure of the society that's created the prejudice and other larger, powerful forces that have contributed to something as complex as prejudice. Okay, so we've got abstract thinking. So they're formal operational thinkers. That's what Piaget calls them. They're in the formal operational stage, and he says they're able to be more abstract. They're very idealistic. They're idealistic about themselves. They're idealistic about the world. And I think that's why they get really impatient with like adults and their parents and teachers, because they probably see adults as being way too limited in their scope. But at the same time, they can be super, super logical. They can be more logical than an adult in some instances. I mean, they're very, their logical, hypothetical, deductive reasoning is just as good as an adult. There are some major differences, though, between emerging adulthood thinking and adolescent thinking. And when we get into emerging adult, we'll talk about it. Okay, so like I said before, one of the big things about abstract thinking in adolescence is this thing called deductive reasoning. So little kids tend to be inductive. They think about the little piece, all right. It's sort of like building up a knowledge base. Inductive reasoning means you try to learn as much as you can about the world around you, and then you get a big picture of what the world is like. With deductive reasoning, they look at the big world and they break it down into its smaller parts to try to understand it. Um, Deductive reasoning is called top-down, and inductive reasoning is called bottom-up. A very good example in your book is for inductive reasoning, it works like this. If it quacks and it waddles and it has feathers, it's a duck. In deductive reasoning, it's a duck if it waddles, quacks, and has feathers. You see the difference? So that's sort of, you know, that's sort of a new level of abstract thinking that adolescents can tackle. Um, uh, there are kind of two ways that most of us make decisions about stuff around us. Now, all of us come to decisions about issues either from we can come from it from an emotional standpoint or from a logical and analytic standpoint. If we look at something like the death penalty, many people feel very, very passionately about it one way or another. And they may make a choice or take a stand on the death penalty solely based on their intuition and their feelings about it. Whereas somebody else might do the complete opposite, make a decision about a really, a big deal like that solely from an analytic perspective. Well, like, we've made mistakes. We've put people to death who actually didn't do the crime, or the drugs that we use to knock people out is inhumane, and there's all kinds of rational, logical concepts or cons against the death penalty. And adolescents have a tendency to go one way or another. A lot of times they go the emotional way. Why? Because it's quick. And adolescents are impulsive, right? We talked about how they don't tend to sit around and wait and weigh all the pros and cons. They like to act, and they like to act quickly. So frequently, teenagers will come to a decision very quickly based on intuitive or emotional feelings about something, and then act really quickly. They don't want to sit around and wait. They want to make it happen. Here's the critical difference between adolescents and emerging adults. Emerging adults tend to actually merge the two. And we'll talk about that, where instead of just going from a solely emotional or a solely analytical, they'll tend to approach big problems from both sides. Okay.